Welcome back to our history lessons. My name is Mohammed. I am history teacher. Today, I will continue with Form 2 students in the second topic called Socio-Economic Development and Production in Pre-Colonial Africa. Socio-economic development and production in pre-colonial Africa. And this is the second lesson. So our today's topic is socio-economic development and production in pre-colonial Africa. Our subtopic will be types of social organizations and production in pre-colonial Africa. Particularly, we are going to discuss the first mode of production existed in pre-colonial Africa, which is primitive communalism. Primitive communalism. In this mode of production, we have already discussed some issues. Dear student, can you remind us what we discussed in the previous lesson? Who can remind us? Yes. Okay, good. In the previous lesson, which was the first lesson, we discussed meaning of key concepts. Who can tell us one of the key concepts we defined or we discussed in the previous lesson? Yes. Production. Another one, human labor. Good. Another one, productive forces. Yes. Good. Another one, social organization. Good. Very good. In the previous lesson, we discussed some key concepts which are used in studying this topic. Also, we discussed the meaning of primitive communalism with some examples of the societies in Africa which practiced primitive communalism. Today, we proceed with this mode of production by discussing the characteristics of primitive communalism. Characteristics of primitive communalism. What are the characteristics of primitive communalism? Remember, primitive communalism is the first mode of production or the first social organization practiced by the Africans before the coming of colonialism. It had its characteristics. What are they? Today, we are going to discuss those or some characteristics of primitive communalism. Some of them can be found in the meaning of primitive communalism. Then the definition or in the meaning of primitive communalism, we can also get some characteristics. Who can try to tell us one of the characteristics of primitive communalism found in the definition or in the meaning of primitive communalism? Who can tell us? Who can tell us? Yes, students. Okay? Good. One of the characteristics of primitive communalism was no private ownership, no private ownership of major means of production, major means of production. Here we mean all major means of production, like land, all tools, all equipments, instruments were shared or were owned. All instruments, or we can say tools, or tools, also land, were owned by all community members. By all community members is where we can get the concept called communal ownership of major means of production. Communal ownership of major means of production. Communal ownership of major means of production. This is one of the characteristics of primitive communalism. No private ownership of major means of production. Are we together? Yes. Another characteristic is absence. Absence of classes. Absence of what? Of classes. During this time, or this era, there were no classes. During this time, in primitive communalism, there were no classes. All people, here we mean all people, all community members, all people, all community members lived and shared everything. And shared everything equally. There was no a class, a higher class. Also, there was no a lower class. All people were equal within the society. So we say absence of classes. In primitive communalism, there were no classes. Another characteristic is absence of exploitation. Absence of exploitation. Exploitation. There was no exploitation of man to man during primitive communalism. There was no exploitation of man to man. All the able-bodied people all community members who were able to supply their power, they did so, and what was collected was also distributed equally. I repeat, during primitive communalism, all community members who were able to supply their power, we mean able-bodied people, engaged in production or supplied their power in production, in hunting, or in any activity, and what was collected from that activity was distributed equally. No one had a right to get excess. All people got equally from what has been collected in production or whatever. So there was no exploitation. All able-bodied people worked together or supplied their power and share the products the products of their work. So, during primitive communalism, there was no exploitation. If there was a person able to work or to supply his power in production, he did so. And what was collected in terms of products or goods was shared by all community members. That's why we say absence of exploitation. Another characteristic is low level of production. Low level of production. In primitive communalism, there was no surplus. There was no surplus. When we are talking about surplus, we mean excess in production or in anything else. So there was no surplus in primitive communalism. The production was very low. Why the production was very low? Who can tell us? What is the reason behind low level of production during primitive communalism? What is the reason behind low level of production in primitive communalism? Who can tell us, students? Yes, who can tell us the reason behind? I need to hear the reason behind low level of production. Why community members, why people lived in this mode or during this mode of production produced low in terms of quantity? Yes, good. The production was very low because of the instrument they used in production. The production was very low because people used stone tools. Or some community members used wooden tools. Sometimes you can get low production because of the tools you use in such production. So the community members got low production. They didn't have surplus in their production because of the tools they used. They used stone tools and wooden tools, which could not be used to produce more. That's why it was very low. That's why production was very low. Another characteristic. Who can tell us another characteristic? Yes. Hunting and gathering. Good. Hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering. This was the most economic activity that practiced by the Africans during primitive communalism. Or community members, or we can say people, when we are talking about people, we mean Africans, engaged in hunting. And here is where we can say people depended on nature. They engaged in hunting animals, finding animals in the thick forest. And what was collected from hunting was also distributed or shared equally. As we have said, there was no exploitation. They engaged in hunting animals. This was one of the major economic activities performed by Africans in primitive communalism. So, also, people in this mode of production or in this social organization gathered, you can say gathered, what they hunted and some natural words, natural, or we can say raw foods found in the areas. So one of the characteristics of primitive communalism was hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering. People hunted animals in the thick forest and also gathered what they hunted and gathered some natural or raw food found in the areas. As we know, people during this time ate raw food like fruits, leaves, and other raw foods. Are we together? Okay. Another characteristic is subsistence economy. Subsistence economy. Subsistence economy. Subsistence what? Subsistence economy. What do we mean by subsistence economy? What do we mean? Here we mean during primitive communalism, people produced. People, here we mean Africans, produced only for consumption. Only for consumption. So they produced, they engaged in production, they hunted, they gathered only for their consumption and not for trade. And not for trade. So one of the characteristics is subsistence economy. Subsistence economy. Another characteristic is dependence on nature. Dependence on nature. Dependence on nature. Africans who lived during this mode of production lived basing on the nature. If they lived in the areas where animals are well found or can be well hunted or found, they are engaging in hunting activity. If they lived in the areas where fishing is very simple, they engaged in fishing. They depended on nature. The environment is what determined or detected the style of life. The environment is what determined the nature of life. The environment is what determined how human being lives. For example, nowadays, people who live near coastal areas, their economic activities are fishing, marine transport. Also, people who live in the areas where minerals found, they engage in mineral extraction. This is what we call depending on nature. You live according to the nature of the environment you live. You live according to the nature of what surroundings you. That's why we say, during primitive communalism, Africans lived according to the nature of the environment. And this is what resulted to the hunting and gathering is one of the major economic activities. Are we together? Have you understood the characteristics of primitive communalism? Okay. The other two characteristics are no specialization. No specialization of labor, no specialization. Here we mean all people performed all activities. There was no specialization of labor. No specialization of labor. Men, women, boys, girls, all perform the same activities. The last one is democracy, presence of democracy. Presence of democracy. Presence of democracy. Here we mean all community members. All community members engaged in making decision concerning their matters. During primitive communalism, all men and women participated in making decision, involved in making decision concerning their issues. There was no sex discrimination in sex, or there was no sexual segregation or discrimination. All men and women involved in making decisions concerning their matters. So these are the characteristics of primitive communalism. I hope you have understood our today's lesson, and you are now able to explain the characteristics of primitive communalism as we have discussed. It is your time to make revision or to revise what we have discussed today. Then don't forget to do the following simply exercise. Don't forget to do the following simple exercise. After revising what we have discussed today, I hope you will be able to attempt the following exercise. The following exercise. The following exercise. Complete each of the following statements with correct historical facts. Historical facts. A. The mode of production. The mode of production which existed much longer than any other mode. Any other mode is called also a system whereby all major means of production are shared by all members. Are shared by all members. Are shared by all. Are shared by all members. Is called. Can do this simple exercise.
Thank you very much for your
I wish you all the best. Thank you very much for your watching, for listening the lesson.
goodbye.
See you next time. Goodbye.